Welcome to Fiction Flux. Today we are starting a brand new fanfic. What if Female Deku could steal emotions instead of quirks? Let's not waste any time and get started. The first time it happened, she was 7 years old. She was standing in the school hallway with a bruise forming on her knee from where Katsuki had shoved her into the lockers, and she was trying very hard not to cry because crying made it worse. Crying always made it worse, and she had gotten very good at holding tears behind her eyes like water behind a dam and just breathing through it until the feeling passed. And then Katsuki walked past her again. And she felt it. Not the fear she always felt when he was close. Not the familiar shrinking, the making herself small, the pulling her shoulders in and looking at the floor. She felt something come out of him and into her like heat through a wall, sudden, total, impossible to misidentify. Rage. His rage, specifically personally, unmistakably his. The burning, cornered, desperate rage of a child who had been told he was extraordinary every day of his life and had started to suspect that extraordinary was a cage and didn't know what to do with that suspicion except direct it outward at anything smaller than himself. She felt it fill her chest like swallowed fire. And then she felt it leave him. She looked up. Katsuki had stopped walking. He was standing 3 feet away with his hand half raised for another shove, and he was looking at his own hand with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Lost, untethered, like something that had always been there wasn't there anymore, and he didn't know what to put in the space it left. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. He walked away, slowly, without the usual swagger. She watched him go, and she felt his rage sitting inside her like borrowed fire, and she didn't know what it was or what had happened, or why she suddenly understood Katsuki Bakugo from the inside, with a completeness that made her chest ache for him even through the bruise on her knee. She went home and didn't tell her mother. She sat by the window and waited for the feeling to fade. It took 3 days. And that was how Izumi Midoriya discovered her quirk, not in a doctor's office, not with a diagnosis or a classification or a number assigned to its potential danger level. She discovered it the way the most important things are discovered, alone, in the aftermath of something she didn't understand, with a bruise on her knee and someone else's fire in her chest. She was quirkless for 7 years. The doctor had told her so. The extra joint in the pinky toe that was supposed to be the marker of the quirkless future, she had it. She had gone through the confirmation and the crying and the grieving the way you grieve a door you never got to open. She had put hero dreams in the category of things she wanted but could not have, and she had been learning to live with that weight the way you learn to live with any weight, by building the muscles to carry it. But the weight had always been wrong. She had always known something was different about her. Not in the way the other kids knew they were different. They knew because their quirks announced themselves. Flame and sound and light and levitation, obvious and classifiable and real. She was different in a way that had no announcement, no drama. She was different in the way she understood people. The way she could be in a room and feel the mood of it change before anyone said a word. The way she always knew when a teacher was tired, or when her mother was scared, or when Katsuki was closer to the edge than usual. She had always thought that was just attention, just observation, just the analytical mind her mother said she had, the one that noticed things. It was not just attention. She understood that fully at age 7, with borrowed rage burning in her chest, and a boy she had known her whole life walking away from her with empty hands and an expression she had never seen on his face. She understood it more at age 8 when she took her mother's grief by accident, touched her hand at dinner, and felt the loneliness come into her like cold water, the specific loneliness of a woman raising a child alone and loving the child completely and still feeling the emptiness of the space where another person was supposed to be. She had held it for a week. It had been the hardest week of her life. She hadn't known grief could have that specific texture, not the sharp grief of loss but the long slow grief of absence, worn smooth by repetition into something almost comfortable, almost like company. She understood it at age 9 when she took a stranger's joy. A man on the subway laughing at something on his phone, and she brushed his sleeve reaching for a handhold. And suddenly, she was full of the specific joy of someone who had just gotten very good news about someone they loved, and the feeling was so clean and so bright that she laughed out loud on a crowded train car before she could stop herself, and the man looked at her, and he wasn't laughing anymore, and the look on his face was confused, looking for something. She learned the way she learned everything, obsessively, thoroughly, with notebooks. By age 10, she had 11 notebooks on emotions. Not on her quirk exactly, she still wasn't entirely sure it qualified as a quirk, still wasn't sure how to categorize what she did. The notebooks were on emotions themselves, what they felt like from the inside, how they were structured. How joy was different from contentment, how fear was different from anxiety, how anger had 17 distinct textures she had identified and catalogued, ranging from the hot surface anger that evaporated quickly to the cold, deep structural anger that had been building for years and held its shape the way stone held heat. She knew human emotions better than she knew herself. She understood people the way she understood heroes, from the outside in, analytically, with affection and precision, and the specific compassion that came from never having the luxury of not understanding why someone was the way they were. She went to the doctor at age 10 and asked to be re-evaluated. The doctor was confused, quirkless was quirkless, the genetic marker didn't lie, but she insisted and her mother supported the insistence, and eventually they got referred to a specialist who ran different tests, better tests. The specialist sat across from them and said something that had never been said in a diagnosis room about this girl before. She does have a quirk, the specialist said, it's just invisible. The quirk had no official name in the database. The specialist called it emotional transference, the ability to absorb an emotion from another person on physical contact, removing it from them and holding it herself. Duration of the absorption varied. The emotion could be held, experienced, and eventually released, either by feeling it fully until it burned out or by deliberate concentration until it faded. Intensity seemed to be within her control, at least partially. The range appeared to be contact-based, though there were notes in the specialist's margin suggesting proximity might eventually be sufficient. She sat very still during the entire explanation. Her mother cried. Relief, Izumi realized, feeling it from across the small gap between their chairs, relief and a retroactive fear. The fear of what the last 3 years would have been like if they had known earlier, and beneath that, the deepest thing, the thing her mother would never say directly. The relief that her daughter was not nothing, that she had never been nothing. Izumi felt all of it and filed it carefully and put her hand over her mother's and said, "I'm okay, Mom." And then she felt her mother's relief flood into her more intensely, and she almost smiled because she had just made it worse by trying to help. She would think about that moment for years, the specific irony of it. She had the most intimate possible access to human emotional experience, and she still managed to make someone feel a thing accidentally. She was not yet in control. She was barely in the introduction to control. But she was in it, and she had a name for what she was, and she had a specialist's notes to add to 11 notebooks, and she felt, sitting in that office with her mother's relief burning warm in her chest, that the door she had thought was closed had been open the whole time. She just hadn't known where the handle was. She still wanted to be a hero. She wanted it more now, because she had something now, not what she had dreamed about, not fire or strength or some obvious dramatic power that would announce itself in battle, but something that was hers. Something that, she was beginning to understand as she flipped through 11 notebooks in her head, was considerably more significant than anything she had let herself believe. She could take someone's courage and they would panic. She could take someone's calm and they would spiral. She could take a villain's rage and leave them confused and untethered. She could, potentially, she had not tested this, she was only beginning to consider it, but the logic seemed sound, fill herself with enough borrowed emotion to push past her own limits in ways that a person operating only on their own internal state never could. She was not quirkless, she had never been quirkless. She was the girl who had been collecting everyone else's feelings since she was 7 years old, and hadn't known that was the most dangerous thing in the world. She met All Might at 15. Not the way she had always dreamed it. Not a rescue, not a dramatic street encounter, not the glowing moment of being chosen. She met him because she had been following his patrol route for 3 weeks, notebook in hand, analyzing his movement patterns, calculating the trajectory of his public appearances, and she had positioned herself on the rooftop of a building she had figured out he would pass at exactly the right angle, and when he passed, she called out to him. He stopped, he looked up. He found a 15-year-old girl with green curly hair and ink on her fingers looking down at him with the expression of someone who had rehearsed this conversation 47 times. She asked him the question she had been carrying for years. Can someone without an obvious combat quirk become a hero? He almost said no. She felt it not from him. She couldn't reach him from that distance, but she could read people's emotional states from the outside well enough by now that she had developed a secondary skill of emotional observation that was nearly as accurate as absorption. She watched his face prepare the answer she'd been dreading, the gentle professional dismissal that would be worse than cruelty because it would be kind. And then something stopped him. She would learn later that what stopped him was what she looked like in that moment, not desperate, not pleading, but exact. Like she had already accepted the possibility of a no, and was asking anyway because she had calculated that asking was worth more than not asking regardless of the answer. He had seen many people ask him many things. He had not seen that particular face before. He sat with her on the rooftop for 2 hours. He did not give her one for all, that was the difference. She did not have the physical baseline he would need to pass it to, not yet, and she was honest with him about why. Her quirk was not physical. It did not enhance her body, it enhanced her understanding. Passing one for all to her would be like pouring a flood into a paper cup. It would destroy her. She was honest about that. She was always honest about the things that were true, even when the truth was not useful. Instead, he gave her something different. He gave her a training plan. He gave her contacts. He gave her, most valuably, his time. Once a week, early morning, in a private gym he still had access to work on the physical training that her quirk did not cover and that hero work would require. He gave her a mentor relationship that was not about passing something down, but about building something up. She cried on the way home, just for a few minutes. Relief and gratitude and the specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a hope carefully for so long that finally being allowed to set it down safely produces its own kind of collapse. She filed the feelings away for later and went home and told her mother and opened notebook 12. UACE entrance exam was the first real test of what she had. The written portion was straightforward. She had been preparing for that since she was 11. The practical portion, the robot-destroying exercise, was the one that had kept her up at night for months. Her quirk was not a combat tool, not directly. She could not throw a punch that broke concrete. She could not generate energy. She could not fly. But she had spent 3 years learning to use what she had, and what she had was this. In any group of panicking people, emotion was a resource, and she was the only one who could collect it. She arrived at the exam site and she stood in the crowd of applicants and she breathed. She felt the crowd's emotion, like weather, the anticipatory anxiety, the competitive confidence, the fear underneath the bravado. She felt Katsuki nearby before she saw him, felt the specific texture of his focused aggression like a furnace someone had banked carefully for exactly this moment. She did not take from him. She never took from him without reason anymore. She was careful. She waited for the signal. When the gates opened and the robots appeared and the crowd dispersed in all directions, she found 2 things immediately. A small cluster of applicants who had frozen, not cowardice. She could feel the difference between cowardice and the specific shutdown of a nervous system, overwhelmed by real stakes for the first time, and the emotional signal she had been planning for. She moved to the frozen cluster. She put her hand briefly on the nearest person's arm. She took their fear. Not the edges, all of it, the whole structure of it. She felt it pour into her, and it was enormous, genuine terror, the kind that had teeth, and she held it, and she felt the person beside her take a breath that was suddenly, inexplicably, unencumbered. She turned to the next person and did the same. And the next. By the time she had touched 5 people in the span of 40 seconds, she was carrying enough collected terror that her own body was trembling with it, and her vision had gone slightly strange at the edges, and she was absolutely filled to the brim with other people's worst feelings, and she was smiling. Not because it felt good, because she had a plan. She ran at the nearest robot with 5 people's worth of terror, amplifying every instinct she had towards survival and escape, and she used the physical training, 10 months of Toshinori Yaga's careful instruction. And she moved like someone who genuinely believed this might be the last moment of her life, because she was carrying the emotions of 5 people who believed exactly that. And she dodged the robot's arm, and she found the weak point she had identified in All Might's notes about industrial machine construction, and she put her full body weight into a strike that would not have been possible for her before she had trained, and was barely possible for her now. The robot went down. She did it again. And again. She did not get the most robots. She was not Katsuki. She was not the person who left the field with destruction and dominance and obvious measurable victory. She got enough. She got enough because she also had the rescue points. All 5 people she had freed from their freeze had passed her and gone on to score, and she had something else, something the exam graders noted carefully. She had never once taken an emotion from someone to make herself feel better. Every absorption had been strategic. Every removal had been to free someone who couldn't free themselves. She passed the exam. She stood on the field after the signal sounded, and she slowly, carefully released the 5 collected terrors, let them disperse, one by one, felt them leave her and watched the trembling in her hands slow. The emotional residue always faded faster when she let it go deliberately rather than waiting it out. She had learned that at age 12. She breathed, the field was empty around her, she looked at the sky. She was going to UA. She was going to UA, and she had no combat quirk and no extraordinary physical ability, and she was carrying the emotional fingerprints of 5 people she had never met, and she was, for the first time in 8 years, exactly as happy as she had always thought she would be if this day ever came. She let herself feel that for 30 seconds. Then she opened her notebook and started writing. The first year of UA was harder and more illuminating than anything she had imagined. She was placed in Class 1A, and she sat at her desk on the first day and felt the room. 20 people, 19 of whom had combat-ready quirks, and one of whom was her. The density of emotion in a room full of competitive 15-year-olds who had just entered the most prestigious hero school in Japan was extraordinary. She had been in emotionally rich environments before, but nothing like this. This was a symphony. She kept her hands to herself. She always kept her hands to herself in new environments until she understood the landscape. She learned her classmates the way she learned everything, thoroughly and from the outside in, observation before absorption. She watched Uraraka's optimism, genuine and self-renewing and never quite touching the worry underneath about her family's financial situation. She watched Iida's sincerity, so total and so deeply felt that it sometimes blinded him to the pragmatic complexity of situations. She watched Todoroki, who was the most emotionally locked room she had ever been near, the equivalent of standing in front of a reinforced door and feeling the temperature difference on either side and knowing there was something enormous in there and having no access. She was fascinated by all of them. She was careful with all of them. Aizawa noticed her first. Of course, Aizawa noticed her first. He was a professional at detecting things that didn't fit the pattern of what they appeared to be, and she was, by any observable measure, a student with a non-combat quirk in a combat-heavy program who shouldn't be passing the physical training benchmarks she was passing, and who never quite looked tired in the ways the other students looked tired after emotional trials. He called her in after the first month. She sat across from him in his office, and she felt him the way she felt everyone, felt the professional calculation, the careful assessment, the specific quality of a man who did not waste attention. And underneath all of that, something she hadn't expected. Genuine curiosity. "Your quirk is listed as emotional transference," he said. He had the file in front of him. "The support documentation is thinner than I'd like." The specialist who classified it was working with limited data, she said. "My understanding of it has developed significantly since then." "Tell me." She told him. She was measured about it. She had learned to be measured, had learned that describing the full scope of what she could do in one unfiltered account had a tendency to produce expressions she found counterproductive. She gave him the accurate version, the technically precise version, the one that emphasized the control she had developed and the strategic application she had already begun to formalize. He listened without expression. She felt him processing it, not fear, she appreciated that, but a kind of rapid strategic calculation that was not unlike what she did with emotions, but applied to tactical situations. "Can you take emotions from multiple people simultaneously?" he said. "I'm working on it," she said. "Currently my reliable limit is 3 before the bleed-through becomes problematic." Bleed-through. "When I hold emotions from multiple sources they begin to interact," she said. "Two people's fear amplifies each other. A person's joy next to another person's grief creates a complicated internal state. I'm developing techniques to compartmentalize." He looked at her for a long time. "You've been doing this since you were 7, he said. "Yes. And you're the only person in your file who knows the full scope of it." "I've been careful," she said. "Why?" She thought about how honest to be. She decided on fully honest, because Aizawa was the kind of person who responded to full honesty better than calibrated honesty, and she had been calibrating for long enough that full honesty felt like its own kind of relief. "Because the first time I described all of it to someone," she said, "they were afraid of me, and fear makes people make decisions I find counterproductive." He looked at her, something in his energy shifted, not toward fear, which she had been braced for, but toward recognition. The specific recognition of someone who understood managing perception out of necessity. "What do you want out of this program?" he said. "I want to learn to use what I have completely," she said, "and I want to become a hero who can help people in ways that other heroes can't." "What ways?" She thought about the 7-year-old with someone else's fire in her chest. She thought about the frozen students on the exam field. She thought about her mother's grief and the stranger's joy and 12 notebooks of catalogued human feeling. "I can go into any situation," she said slowly, "and understand exactly what is driving every person in it, not their quirks, their actual motivation, their fear, their love, what they're protecting, what they've lost, what they're desperate for. I can remove the emotion that's preventing them from thinking clearly. I can give people back their calm when panic would kill them. I can understand a villain from the inside in a way that no one else can." She paused. "And if I need to, I can take everything that makes someone a threat, their conviction, their rage, their will to fight, and hold it until they have nothing left to act on." Silent. "That last part," Aizawa said. "I've done it twice," she said, "under controlled conditions with volunteers. And it's total," she said. "A person without their will to fight is not a threat, they're just a person." He looked at the file, he looked at her, he closed the file. Extra training sessions, he said. Tuesdays and Thursdays, you'll work with me directly on combat applications. She felt briefly a warmth she recognized as gratitude mixed with relief, so intense it had physical weight. Yes, sir, she said. She didn't take it from him, she just felt it herself, it was hers. The first real crisis came during the USJ attack. She had known something was wrong before anyone announced it. She had been in the building when the villains arrived. She felt the emotional shift like a pressure change, hundreds of people's sudden fear arriving all at once like a wave, and underneath it, the specific hot, focused intention of people who had come here to hurt and were not conflicted about it. She had been standing near Aizawa at the observation point when the warp gate opened, and everything changed. She made a decision in the space of 2 seconds. She grabbed Aizawa's arm. He turned sharp, immediate, prepared to respond to threat. She looked at him and she said very fast, "There are 13 distinct emotional signatures in the main atrium. The large one, the Nomu, it has no fear. None at all, that's the biggest threat. The one giving orders is running on something that isn't standard aggression. It's more complicated, there's desperation in it, which means he's on a timeline. The warp villain feels nothing about any of this. He's the most dangerous for movement control." Aizawa stared at her for 1 second. "Can you do anything from here?" he said. "Not from here," she said. "I need proximity." "Then stay back," he said, and he was moving, the capture scarf unwinding, and she watched him go and she made a different decision. She did not stay back. She moved through the USJ carefully, using the cover and the chaos and the very precise emotional map she was building as she moved closer, feeling every villain in the space, tracking their states, finding the ones whose conviction was weakest, the ones whose fear was closest to the surface, the ones who were here because they had nowhere else to go and not because they believed in this. She found one, a villain near the flood zone with a water manipulation quirk, and underneath his performed aggression, the specific texture of someone who had been told this was the only option and had almost believed it but not quite. She got close enough to touch. She put her hand on his wrist. She took his conviction. Not his fear, she left that. She took the specific belief that he was doing the right thing, the ideology that was powering his actions, the sense of purpose that had gotten him into this building. She felt it come into her and she felt him feel it leave, and she watched his face change. He looked at his hands, he looked at the water he had been controlling, he looked at her. "I don't," he said, and then he stopped and sat down and stayed down for the rest of the fight. She moved to the next one. She was doing this, working the edges of the villain group, taking conviction and focus and the will to fight, freeing her classmates to deal with the remaining threats when the Nomu appeared in front of her. She felt nothing from it. That was what All Might's notes had not prepared her for and what her 11 years of notebooks had not accounted for. The Nomu was not empty, it was not unconscious. It had something in it that was technically an emotional state, the low, flat, structural certainty of something that had been engineered to function without the interference of doubt or fear or hesitation. Not absence, presence. Just a presence so alien to everything she had catalogued that she stood in front of it and felt her quirk reach out and find nothing to hold. It raised its arm. She had Katsuki's rage from age 7 still indexed in her memory, not in her chest. She had released it years ago, but catalogued. She had her mother's grief. She had the exam field's terror. She had every significant emotional experience she had ever absorbed, not held anymore but remembered, the way you remember a song without hearing it. She had learned at age 13 that she could do something she had never heard of another emotional type doing. She could generate from memory. Not the same as taking, not as clean, not as total, not as reliable, but she could reach into her catalogue and reconstruct a shadow of a felt emotion, build it from the inside, use it to push her own body and mind past what they would otherwise do. It was like the difference between eating food and remembering the taste so vividly you produce saliva. Not the same, but real. She generated rage, not hers, Katsuki's, the specific focused incandescent fury of someone who had been told he was extraordinary and refused to accept any evidence to the contrary. She used that fury to move. She went under the Nomu's arm. She came up behind it. She did not touch its skin. Touching it had given her nothing. Its emotional landscape was too alien. But she grabbed the nearest villain within reach, the warp gate user, and she put her hand on his face, and she did something she had never done at full capacity outside of her controlled tests. She took everything. His calm, his focus, his disengagement, the specific cold professionalism he used to move through situations like this without feeling the weight of them. She took all of it and she felt it pour into her, and she heard him make a sound she had never heard before, and she watched him fold. Without him to control the warp gate, the logistics of the villain's escape collapsed. It was not elegant. She was shaking badly by the time backup arrived, carrying more simultaneous emotional weight than she had ever held. 6 villains worth of stolen conviction and focus, and in 2 cases genuine belief in something. And she held all of it and kept all of it compartmentalized, and she did not let it out until All Might arrived and the fight was over, and she found a corner of the USJ and sat down and released it all at once. Letting it all go at once was always the worst part. Each emotion leaving created its own absence, a flash of each person's individual emotional reality gone. She always felt slightly hollow afterward, not empty, just used the way a muscle feels used after real work. Aizawa found her sitting in the corner with her hands in her lap. He sat beside her, he didn't say anything, she appreciated that. 6, she said eventually. I know, he said. The Nomu had nothing I could reach. I know that too. I should work on that, she said, on contact types that aren't human, on engineered or altered emotional states. Yes, he said. Probably, she said, and she felt herself smile slightly even though she was exhausted. You're going to tell me I should have stayed back. You should have stayed back, he said. You also ended the fight. He paused. We'll talk about the hierarchy of those 2 facts later. She nodded. She sat in the quiet, and she felt the aftermath of the USJ settle around her. The genuine fear of her classmates, the pride under Aizawa's exhaustion, the distant fading signatures of the remaining villains, the enormous relief of the students who had not known until 10 minutes ago whether they were going to survive today. She felt all of it, and she let herself feel it without taking any of it, and she thought about what it meant to be built the way she was built. She thought about the Nomu and the nothing she had felt from it. She had always understood people by understanding their feelings. The Nomu was a person who had been made into something that felt differently than people, and she had found the edge of her ability and fallen off it, and she had been lucky that the fall was survivable. She pulled out her notebook. She opened to a new page. She wrote at the top, things that don't feel like people, and how to reach them anyway. She wrote for an hour. By the time she finished, the recovery teams had arrived, and the situation was being managed, and her classmates were being looked after, and the ordinary machinery of aftermath was in motion. She capped her pen. She felt, underneath the exhaustion and the hollow and the careful clinical distance she had maintained through the whole fight, something she had been waiting for since she was 7 years old. She felt like a hero. It was hers, she didn't take it from anyone. It was completely, entirely, unmistakably hers. She held on to it with everything she had. The months after the USJ changed things in ways she had been tracking carefully. The attention on her was different now. Not just from Aizawa, who had restructured their training sessions significantly and was now pushing her into territory she had not previously explored. From her classmates, who had processed the events of that day differently than she would have predicted. She had expected wariness. People who learned what her quirk could do tended to produce wariness. The specific discomfort of knowing that your emotional interior was potentially accessible to another person was not a comfortable knowledge. Some of her classmates did go quiet around her after they understood. She felt it, the slight guardedness, the monitoring of their own faces, the very human instinct to protect the inside when someone had demonstrated they could see it. But some of them did something she had not expected. They came closer. Uraraka found her in the library 2 weeks after the USJ and sat down across from her without preamble and said, "Can you feel what someone is feeling right now, without touching?" Izumi looked at her. She felt Ochako's emotional state, warm, nervous, determined, and she made a decision to answer honestly. From a short distance sometimes, she said, it's less precise than contact, more like impression than information. Can you feel me right now? You're nervous, she said, but you decided before you sat down that you were going to ask anyway. And underneath the nerves, there's something I'd call determination. She paused, and something smaller that I think is loneliness but might be something more specific that I don't have a word for yet. Uraraka looked at her for a long moment. That's incredibly strange, she said. Yes, Izumi said. I kind of love it, Uraraka said. I've always wished someone could actually understand what I was feeling instead of just guessing. She paused. Is that weird to say? No, Izumi said, and felt something she recognized as warmth expand in her own chest, her own, not borrowed, genuinely hers. That's one of the least weird things anyone has said to me. Uraraka became her first real friend, not the friendship she had with Ida, which was genuine but structured around mutual respect and shared goals. A different kind, the kind that grew out of being seen and not running from it. Todoroki was the harder one. She had felt the locked room of him since day one. She had not tried to access it, had not even let herself get close enough for casual contact, because she had the specific professional ethics about her quirk that came from 12 years of thinking carefully about consent, and she did not take without understanding what she was taking. But she observed the way the locked room got slightly more locked when his father's name came up, the way it got slightly less locked in training sessions when he was focused completely on technique and not on anything else, the way it got complicated and strange and architecturally interesting when he was near her specifically, which she filed under things to examine later and mostly did not examine. She was 16. She was not entirely able to maintain clinical detachment about everything. She made a decision about Todoroki. Not to take, not to read from contact. She decided to talk to him the way she talked to anyone she was trying to understand directly about real things with no agenda except the truth. She invited him to study in the library. He came, which surprised her. They studied. She did not try to access his emotions at all, kept herself deliberately closed, which was its own kind of hard work, like walking past something very loud with your hands over your ears. He talked first, eventually. Not about the big things, about small things, about a technique he was developing, about something he had read that he found interesting. She responded in kind, and she felt the locked room change, not open, but breathe slightly differently, the way a sealed space changes when there's a small gap somewhere. They studied in the library every Thursday for 2 months before he said anything real. What he said was, "You never try to do your quirk thing on me." "No," she said. "Why?" "Because I would need to touch you," she said, "and I wouldn't do that without asking. And I haven't asked because I don't think you'd want me to, and I respect that." He was quiet for a moment. "What if I wanted you to?" he said. She looked at him, she felt herself very still. "Then I'd ask you to tell me specifically what you were consenting to," she said carefully, "because it's not a small thing, and I take it seriously." He looked at her with those mismatched eyes that she had learned, from observation alone, carried different weights. The grey one was the one that showed things, the blue one was the one that guarded. "The grey eye is more expressive," she said, before she could stop herself. He blinked. "I notice things," she said. "I'm sorry, I don't always catch myself." "No," he said slowly, "don't be sorry." And the locked room did something she felt even without contact, some small structural shift, not opening, not even close to opening, but acknowledging that there was something inside it, acknowledging her presence on the other side of the door. She filed that carefully, she did not push. She was learning, slowly and through consistent effort, that her quirk had given her extraordinary access to people's interiors, and that access had to be held with the most careful hands she could develop, because the alternative was a kind of intimacy that people had not agreed to, and that changed the nature of every relationship she had. She was building the ethics of what she was at the same time, she was building the skill of it. That was harder than the skill. She wrote about it in Notebook 17. She wrote, "The capacity to understand someone completely does not give you the right to do so. Understanding requires invitation. Taking without invitation is a different thing, even when what you are taking is just feeling, just the interior weather of a person who doesn't know you are standing in their rain." She reread that line 3 times. She wrote under it, "Remember this. More important than the notebooks on emotion, more important than the training. This is the thing I must always know." The sports festival was where the world found out. She had not planned it that way. She had planned to use her quirk as she always used it, strategically, surgically, the minimum necessary application. She was not interested in spectacle, she was interested in outcome. But the bracket placed her against Shinso in the first round, and Shinso's quirk was brainwashing, and she felt him preparing it the moment she entered the ring, and what she decided to do in the 4 seconds between stepping into the ring and the match beginning was not surgical at all. Shinso was angry. She felt it from 6 feet away, not the hot surface anger but the long, slow structural anger she had catalogued since childhood. The anger of someone who had been told their quirk wasn't hero material, who had fought his entire life against a classification that the system had made for him without asking him. She recognized it. She understood it at a depth that had nothing to do with her quirk, and everything to do with 11 years of being quirkless in a world that used that word as a sentence. She looked at him across the ring, and she felt his anger, and she made a decision. She let him use the brainwashing. Not because she didn't have options. She had 3 separate plans for countering his quirk that she had developed in the 2 days since the bracket was announced. She let him use it because she felt what he needed, felt it clearly, precisely, without contact, from the surface reading she had developed, and what he needed was not to be countered. What he needed was to be seen. She felt the brainwashing hit her, and she let it settle, and she walked toward him the way he commanded, and she got close enough to touch, and she put her hand on his arm, and she took one thing. One small thing. His certainty that no one saw him, that nobody in this stadium, nobody in the hero course, nobody with a flashy powerful combat quirk had ever looked at him and thought, that person has something real. She took that certainty and held it, and she stepped outside the ring herself. She lost the match. The stadium was confused. Her classmates were confused. Aizawa's face was unreadable in the way it always was when she had done something he needed to think about. Shinso stood in the ring looking at her. She felt him feel the absence of that certainty, felt the specific disorientation of a thing you've always believed suddenly not being there to believe in, and she looked at him and she said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "You should be in the hero course. The system is wrong about you. I know it because I know how to read what people are actually made of, and what you're made of is the right thing." He stared at her. "I lost on purpose," she confirmed, "because I thought you should go further in this tournament, and because I thought you'd been told you weren't good enough for long enough." She walked off the ring. She heard the crowd processing what had happened. She felt the confusion and the curiosity, and the beginning of something she had felt before in smaller doses, but not at this scale. People were trying to understand her. The broadcast cameras had caught enough. Not what she said, the audio hadn't reached, but the gesture, the deliberate loss, the hand on his arm, the look on Shinso's face afterward, which was the look of someone who had had something removed and didn't know whether to be relieved or bereft. The forums went active within the hour. She knew because Uraraka was monitoring them on her phone and kept making sounds that were hard to categorize. "They're calling it emotional manipulation," Uraraka said. "Half of them think you're terrifying." "And the other half," Izumi said. Uraraka looked at her phone. She looked at Izumi. She put the phone away. "The other half want to know everything about you," she said. "Like everything." Izumi thought about that. She thought about being known. She thought about what she had written in Notebook 17, about understanding requiring invitation. She thought about 7 billion people who had never been understood from the inside. 7 billion people carrying their fear and their love and their grief and their hope in the dark interior space of themselves, with no one who could reach it, and no language for the parts that mattered most. She thought about what a person could do with what she had, if she spent her whole life doing it right. She was 16 years old, and she had 17 notebooks, and a quirk the classification system had almost missed, and a friendship she hadn't expected, and a door she had found in the dark when she was 7 that had turned out to be the most important door of her life. She was not done. She was so early in the beginning that the beginning hadn't even begun to show her what it was made of. But she knew this. She knew it the way she knew the texture of courage, and the shape of grief, and the specific warmth of someone's relief when they finally feel safe. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. And somewhere ahead, somewhere in the part of the story she hadn't reached yet, there was a moment coming. She could feel the shape of it the way she felt the shape of approaching emotion, something vast and complicated, and unlike anything she had catalogued before. She was going to be ready. She was always going to be ready. She pulled out Notebook 18. She started writing. That's it for today. Hope you liked this one. Comment for part 2. Don't forget to subscribe and share. See you in the next one.